If you have trouble understanding fast natural English, then this video is for you. I've put together a collection of the favourite stories from the channel and removed all the vocabulary guidance and the speaking practice, so it's just the stories. So you can simply hit play and read while you listen, or just listen while you do something else. Perhaps go for a walk, or go for a drive in your car. I have included a link to the original videos in the description so that if you want, you can watch those vocabulary explanations and also download the free guides to the videos. But this video is just about listening. Hi, I'm Steve. Let's do this. The Odd Couple. Saying Serena was pretty was like saying an ocean was quite big, or Bill Gates was fairly wealthy. Her husband Jeff was used to people, both men and women, staring at her whenever as a couple they walked into a room. Sometimes he would hear them whisper as they questioned what such a fantastic looking woman was doing with such an ordinary looking man. But what they didn't know was that the beautiful Serena had a very strange character flaw. They met 10 years ago in the spring sunshine when Jeff was late for a class and was taking a shortcut across the university grounds, when he noticed that every student, as well as some of the professors, had their heads turned towards the main gates. Naturally, being curious, he also swiveled in the direction they were looking, and there she was, Serena, striding along the main path whilst making everyone else seem ordinary in comparison. No longer caring that he was late for class, he stopped, crouched down and pretended to adjust his rucksack so it wouldn't seem so obvious that she had his total attention. But instead of walking past, she stopped right beside him, and he found himself looking up into the most amazing eyes he had ever seen. "I don't mean to alarm you," she said, "but I've just seen a huge spider crawl into your bag." With a yelp, Jeff flung his bag to the ground, and all his books fell across the path. "I was only joking," she giggled. "I didn't think you'd fall for that. I'm really sorry." And that was it. Serena, who had the face of an angel and a figure that caused traffic to slow down, simply loved to play tricks on people. "Let me help you put your stuff back in your bag, and then you can walk me to class," she smiled. After 3 years of suffering her pranks, on a rainy November afternoon, Jeff found himself standing in Leicester Registry Office, surrounded by his family, waiting for Serena to arrive and become his wife. However, 20 minutes after the appointed time, her sister Rose came running in, shouting, "She's had second thoughts. She's decided she doesn't want to get married." Everyone was shocked, except for Jeff, who calmly asked, "How long before she actually arrives, Rose?" "I'm really sorry, Jeff," she said sheepishly. "She's outside now. She made me do it." "No problem. I'm used to it," he sighed. "Calm down, everyone. Serena will be here at any moment." And sure enough, as soon as he finished speaking, the large door opened and in strolled the bride-to-be with a cheeky smile on her gorgeous face. The years sped by and their marriage blossomed. Serena often joked that no one else would put up with her silly tricks, and Jeff was her ideal man. Despite their differences, their love was genuine and deep. Serena's pranks kept their relationship lively, and Jeff's patience and humour were the perfect balance to her mischievous nature. But it would be wrong to say he always took her shenanigans in his stride. For example, one autumn morning, Jeff jumped into his BMW, which was his pride and joy, and turned the key to find total silence. He tried and tried to start it, to no avail. Finally, popping open the bonnet, he stared in amazement at the empty space where the car's engine should be. It turned out that Serena had paid a fortune for a mechanic to totally remove it during the night. But she said the look of surprise on Jeff's face was totally worth it. Of course, occasionally Jeff tried to turn the tables and fool her, but she always saw through his attempts, and in the end he gave up, content to just have the most beautiful woman in the world to call his wife. One day, Serena decided to pull off her most audacious prank yet. She wrote a note saying she was leaving him for another man and placed it on the coffee table in their living room. She fully expected Jeff to be distraught when he read it. She then quickly hid behind the curtains, stifling her giggles, waiting for the perfect moment to jump out and yell, "Surprise!" Keeping as still as a statue, she heard Jeff come through the front door and take his coat off in the hallway. "Serena, are you home, love?" he shouted, but of course this was met with silence. Entering the living room, he found the note where she'd left it on the coffee table. He picked it up, read it, and from behind the curtains, Serena could hear him sigh. Then unexpectedly, he took out a pen and wrote something at the bottom of the note. A few seconds later, picking up his phone, he said loudly, "She's finally left. Now we can be together, my darling. I'll come and meet you straight away." And with that, he rushed out of the house, and Serena heard Jeff's car drive away. Now, upset and confused, she rushed out from her hiding place, tears streaming down her cheeks. She hurried to the note, heart pounding, and read what Jeff had written. "I can see your feet sticking out from under the curtain, you idiot. I've gone to get some bread." Run for your life. If someone was being kind, then they would have called me plump, or maybe even chubby. But let's not sugarcoat it, I was fat. But all that changed the day my boss gave me the push. A year ago, I was working in a dead-end job as a receptionist. It was supposed to be a temporary stopgap until I found my dream job, but to be honest, I simply couldn't be bothered trying to find anything else. The money was okay, and it was next to McDonald's, where I indulged every lunchtime, hence my weight. Another bonus was that all my colleagues were lovely, except for Max, my boss. He was a bully, and from my first day, he made it his mission to make my life a misery. It all came to a head when he called me into his office for a little chat. "Don't bother sitting down," he said. "I've decided to let you go." I could feel my face start to flush. "You're giving me the sack?" "But why?" I asked. "What have I done?" He looked me slowly up and down and said, "It's not what you've done. It's just that you project the wrong image for this firm." There was little point in arguing, so I went back to my desk, packed up my things, and for the last time walked out into the street. I was at the lowest ebb of my life, but as I made my way back home, I was determined to make some big changes. Once I arrived, I went straight into my kitchen and purged the cupboards of the junk food that I had bought. All of the crisps, biscuits and sweets ended up in the bin. Next, I went to my wardrobe and unearthed a pair of training shoes that I had been given as a present but hadn't even taken out of the box. Surprisingly, they fit and were really comfy. I decided there and then to kill two birds with one stone. I would run to the local job centre, which would start to get me fit, and hopefully I would find my ideal job. However, my good intentions withered away in less than a minute, as by the time I got to the end of my road, I was forced to stop because I was so out of breath. Wheezing like an asthmatic walrus, I continued the rest of the way at a brisk walk. I finally arrived at the job centre, and after a short wait, I saw an advisor who asked me all about my qualifications and work experience. "We do have a new opening," she said, "but it's a little unusual." "I'm up for anything," I replied. "I'm desperate for a job because my rent's due." Handing me a sheet of typed paper, she said, "The job's for an administration officer at the local zoo." She smiled and continued, "I really think it would be right up your street." "I do like animals," I joked, reading the details she'd given me. "I'll get in touch straight away." That was 12 months ago, and what a year it's been. I did get the job working at the zoo, and it's been a revelation, simply the best job in the world for me. I also kept up my new healthy lifestyle and shed a lot of weight, mainly by running to work instead of getting the bus. Which brings us up to date, and today is a special day at the zoo as a new male lion is being brought in, and although I only work in the office, I've been given time off to go and watch as this magnificent animal is being unloaded and introduced into its new enclosure. I slipped on my now worn trainers and set off across the zoo. 5 minutes later, I stood with a crowd of both staff and public as the lorry pulled up carrying the zoo's latest attraction. We could all hear the mighty roars coming from inside. We watched as the zookeepers transferred what must have been one of the biggest lions I have ever seen to its new home. The excitement over, I started to jog back to the office building when I heard a familiar voice say, "Alison, is that really you?" I stopped and looked, and sure enough, it was my old boss, Max. "Yes," I said, "I work here now." Slowly looking me up and down, he said in a surprised voice, "I hardly recognised you. You're a shadow of your former self." Full of confidence, I was going to give him a piece of my mind. But before I could give him both barrels, we saw a crowd of people rushing past us. One of them shouted, "The lion's escaped!" "Which way is it going?" said Max. "Well, we're not chasing it," the man replied ironically as he sped away down the path towards the exit. We both turned and looked in the direction of the lion enclosure, and sure enough, we could see the enormous beast coming towards us. I bent down and started tightening my shoelaces. "What are you doing, you idiot?" said Max in a panicky voice. "You can't outrun a lion." Setting off, I shouted over my shoulder, "Ah, but I don't have to outrun a lion. I just have to outrun you." I Spy. The quiet cul-de-sac of Highfield Close was perhaps the most boring place to live in the whole of England. The houses were all identical, with neatly trimmed lawns and perfectly pruned hedges. The people that lived there all had the same sort of jobs and drove similar cars. So if you had to use one word to describe it, Highfield Close was dull. Or at least it was, until Mike arrived. For the last 5 years, Scarlett and Ryan Robertson had lived at number 14 with their 2 children, Jack, who had just started school, and Lily, who was still a toddler. Scarlett was a stay-at-home mum and budding author who'd been trying for years without success to complete a romance novel, and Ryan was employed by an export company. One Saturday morning, the usual sounds of lawnmowers and birds chirping was interrupted by the powerful engine of an Aston Martin sports car pulling up the drive of number 15. Curious residents stopped and stared, some, like Scarlett, peeking from behind their curtains. "Look at that car! It's like something out of a James Bond movie," she exclaimed her voice full of excitement. Ryan glanced up from his iPad, which he'd been using to find a local plumber to fix the leak in their bathroom. "It's just a car, Scarlett. It must be our new neighbour." Number 15 had been up for sale since the old lady, Mrs. Evans, who had lived there for over 50 years, had passed away. But the sleek car really impressed Scarlett, and she continued to stare out of the window. In fact, she was even more impressed when the driver's door opened and out stepped a tall, very handsome man in his mid-30s. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and he wore a crisp white shirt and dark jeans. To Scarlett, it seemed that he had just stepped off the cover of a magazine. "I'm just taking the bin out," she said to her husband, while rushing to the kitchen door. This really got Ryan's attention, because this was the one chore that his wife hated more than any other. "It's okay, I'll do it when I take the kids to the park," he shouted back. But Scarlett was already heading out of the door, with the bin bag firmly clutched in her hand. Unfortunately, she was too slow, and only just in time to see their mysterious new neighbour going through his front door. "Bugger," she said under her breath. Over the next week, and much to the amusement of her husband, Scarlett made a determined effort to find out all she could about the new resident of Highfield Close. She noticed that his bedroom curtains stayed closed until well past noon, and almost every night he climbed into his sports car and roared off out of the close. Whenever she managed to glimpse him walking to and from his car, she saw that he was always impeccably dressed, and although he flashed a friendly smile to both her and the other neighbours, he never said more than hi. "Don't you think it's strange that he never has any visitors?" she asked Ryan, who was playing on the carpet with their youngest, Lily. Instead of replying, he said to his daughter, "We think Mummy is a little obsessed with the good-looking man next door, don't we, Lily?" Lily looked up at her father and said, "Silly Mummy," which made both Ryan and Scarlett burst out laughing. The following weekend, the morning sun bathed the quiet cul-de-sac in a golden light, and like every Sunday, Ryan was mowing the lawn. What was unusual was that his wife had decided to help him, or at least that's what she said, when the reality was she was lurking by the garden fence. "You're wasting your time, love. He doesn't seem to get up until past midday," Ryan said while shaking his head in amusement. But to both their surprise, the bright blue door of number 15 opened, and there he was, making a beeline to his magnificent car. Seizing her chance, she shouted, "Hi, I'm your neighbour Scarlett. Welcome to the neighbourhood," while giving him a warm smile. A troubled look crossed his face, but was wiped away in an instant, as the handsome man replied, "Hi, I'm Mike. It's very nice to meet you." What a voice! To Scarlett it sounded like a mix of a BBC newsreader and a rock star. She could feel herself starting to blush. Recovering her composure, she said, "That's my husband Ryan," pointing in the vague direction of the lawn, where Ryan was now raking the grass. "I'm afraid I have to dash," Mike said, starting to climb into his car. "I have an urgent job to do." Eager to find out more, Scarlett asked, "So what is it you do?" while trying to sound casual. By now, Mike was sat in the driver's seat and had wound down the window in order to answer, his smile faltering slightly. "Nothing exciting. I don't really like to talk about it. I must get on. Bye." As he was talking, he had already started to speed away, leaving Scarlett standing at the fence, her mind whirring. Marching over to her husband, who was now taking a break on the bench, she shared her suspicions. "I knew it. Our new neighbour is a spy." "Don't be so ridiculous," Ryan said, still shaking his head in amusement. "What on earth made you jump to that conclusion?" "It's so obvious. A blind man on a galloping horse could see it," she said in exasperation. "Well, why don't you talk me through your evidence?" said her husband, putting down his cup of tea. "For a start, there's the car." "Nobody around here has anything like it," she said, while gesturing vaguely at the other houses in the cul-de-sac. Giving her a confused look, Ryan said, "That's because everyone around here, including us, has children, so they all have family cars." "Okay," she countered. "Why is he always going out late at night and coming back in the early hours of the morning, Mr. Clever Clogs?" "Maybe he works the night shift at a factory," said Ryan, trying hard to stop himself laughing. "What, wearing such fancy clothes?" Scarlett was getting a little irate at her husband disagreeing with her conclusions. This wasn't helped when he replied, "Perhaps he gets changed when he gets there, or maybe he's the boss." His wife had heard enough and walked back towards their house, turning to say, "Then he wouldn't be so secretive. It's so obvious he's a spy." And with that, she went inside, leaving Ryan to contemplate what a crazy wife he had. The following Thursday, Ryan was driving home from work when his mobile phone rang. Using his hands-free kit, he answered, and it was Scarlett. "Can you nip into the supermarket on your way home? I forgot to get Lily's nappies." "No problem. I'm just passing it now," he replied. "See you in a bit." Pulling into the car park, he got out of his old family car and noticed straight away the silver Aston Martin belonging to his mysterious, or at least he was according to his wife, neighbour. Determined to get to the bottom of the whole thing, Ryan made a point of having a good look around the store, and sure enough, there was the immaculately dressed, dashing figure of Mike. He was in the off-license section of the store, buying a very expensive bottle of champagne. Putting a look of surprise on his face, Ryan said, "Hi, Mike is it? I'm Ryan, Scarlett's husband from next door." Swapping the champagne bottle to his left hand, Mike reached out with his right, saying, "It's great to finally meet you, Ryan. I've been looking for a chance to apologise to you." Shaking the offered hand, Ryan looked confused. "Apologise? Whatever for?" "I know my car is very noisy, and because I work until the early hours, I was concerned that I might be waking you up." Shaking his head, Ryan replied, "To be honest, what with our new double glazing, we hardly notice." Seizing his chance, he added, "What is it you do?" Mike sighed and, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, said, "I guess there's no point beating about the bush. I don't usually tell people, but the truth is, I'm an exotic dancer." Ryan blinked, momentarily taken aback. "A male stripper? Really?" Mike nodded, looking a little embarrassed. "Yes, my parents died last year in an accident and left me their house, but I couldn't face living there after they'd gone, so I sold up and with the money bought the house next door to you and my dream car, the Aston Martin." Intrigued, Ryan asked, "So how did you get into the exotic entertainment business?" Mike took a deep breath and replied, "It started when I was at university, just to earn a few bob. Lots of the other students were doing it, and it turns out I had the looks and the knack for it. But I don't really like talking about what I do, because I find some people are very judgmental." Ryan laughed and clapped him on his shoulder. "Well, you won't get any judgment from me, my friend. I'm a little jealous I don't have the looks to do the same. I would give up my boring job in a heartbeat." Later that evening, Ryan recounted the conversation to Scarlett, who tried to hide her disappointment that her theory that Mike was a spy had been debunked. "So he's a male stripper then," she said. "Well, at least we have one person living in Highfield Close that does something interesting." "Yes, Scarlett. No international espionage, just a normal bloke with an unconventional job." Ryan was interrupted by his mobile phone ringing. He glanced at the screen and his expression changed. "It's work," he said as he stepped into the hall, leaving his wife watching a soap on the telly. "Agent Delta 8713, he said in a low voice. "Agent Delta 8713, we have a situation. Your presence is required in St. Petersburg immediately," the voice on the other end of the phone commanded. "Understood. I'm leaving now." He hung up and took a moment to think through the implications of the call and to compose himself before returning to the living room and Scarlett. "Who was that?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the programme she was engrossed in. "Just work," he said, forcing a smile. "They need me to go to a boring conference for a couple of days." Fame. Growing up in Bristol as a teenager was a drag. Mum was a single parent, so we were always short of money. That meant having to make excuses when my friends arranged to go out to the pictures or to Starbucks. I just didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. "Not off out with your mates, Sophie," Mum would say, and I'd come up with some excuse as to why I was spending another Saturday afternoon sat on the sofa watching whatever rubbish was on the telly. But all that changed on a rainy Wednesday in October. We had just finished our music lesson when our teacher, Miss Price, said, "School is putting on a performance of Grease, the musical. If any of you are interested in taking part, please let me know." "What do you think?" I asked Kate, my best friend. "It might be a laugh." More importantly, I was thinking, it's something we can do for free. "I'll give it a go if you will," she replied. A week later, after auditions, I was chosen to play the role of Marty, and Kate was made up because she got the lead part of Sandy. "Ugh, that means I'll have to kiss Ron Rottenteeth," she complained, when she found out that Ron Wilson, our classmate, had been picked to be the male lead, Danny. "His teeth aren't that bad," I laughed. "Just buy him some mints." With all the rehearsals, the next month flew by, and soon it was the 22nd of November, our opening night. Kate was in a real flap. "I'm shaking like a leaf," she whined. "I can't remember a single line I'm supposed to say." I smiled reassuringly. "You'll be great. Once you step onto the stage, all your nerves will disappear." And I was right, or at least I was for me. Somehow standing there under the lights, knowing the eyes of my schoolmates and their parents were on me, felt fantastic. After the show, Miss Price had organised a small party for the cast and their families, and Mum was there beaming, embarrassingly telling everyone how proud she was of me. I was just getting ready to leave when a man who had been speaking with Ron, whose teeth really weren't that bad, approached us and said, "Hi, I'm Tim Wainwright, Ron's uncle. I'd like to congratulate you on a smashing performance." Before I could reply, Mum said, "She was brilliant, wasn't she?" "Yes, she really was," Mr. Wainwright replied. "Here's my card. I have an interesting project young Sophie might be perfect for." He handed Mum a small business card, and with a brief goodbye, both he and Ron turned and left. "What do you make of that?" I said. But Mum didn't answer. She was staring at the small white card in her hand. "What does it say?" I asked, snatching it from her, and also going quiet as I read, "Tim Wainwright, Assistant Manager, Bold Records." The next morning, after a sleepless night, I badgered Mum to make the phone call while I sat next to her on the sofa, trying to hear every word. "Hi, is that Tim? This is Sophie's mum, Dawn Jenkins." "Thanks so much for getting in touch, Mrs. Jenkins," he replied. "May I call you Dawn?" "Of course, but please, we are both dying to know. What's this all about?" His reply simply took my breath away. I'd been given the task of putting together a girl band to represent the UK at the Eurovision Song Contest next spring. And after hearing your daughter last night, I believe she is just the ticket to join the band. I had to prod Mum to get her to speak. "That sounds very exciting. We love Eurovision, don't we, Sophie?" said Mum, giving away the fact that I was listening to the conversation. "Is there a chance you can pop into my office and we can go through the details?" "Of course," said Mum. "A clever man once said that everyone will be famous for 15 minutes, and that telephone call was the starting point for me. Over the course of a month, I met the 3 other members of the group I would be joining. Even though they were all a little older than me, we got on okay. We rehearsed our contest song, which was called The Runway of Love. To be honest, I thought it was a bit naff. We got fitted for our costumes, which made us look like air stewardesses. And finally, on live TV, we were presented to the whole of the UK as the Primroses, Britain's great hope for the contest. Oh, and perhaps the strangest thing of all, Tim decided that from now on I should change my name to Sophie Shine. Before I knew what was happening, it was spring, and the rest of the girls and I were at the competition in Slovenia. Backstage, I was going over and over my lines of the song. "Jet into my life, on the runway of delight. Take off, let's make a start, on the romance in our hearts." I did warn you that it was naff. 5 minutes later, it was all over. We left the stage and went to a waiting area with the other contestants who had already performed. The tension was palpable. Last to take the stage was France, and they brought the house down with a really catchy tune about a 3-legged cat. Or at least I thought it was, but then I always fail my French tests in school. Finally, it was time for the results, and we watched TV screens as the show went to various countries who gave their favourite acts points from 12, which was the maximum, down to 0. I'll make this brief. We got 3 points. I don't mean 3 from each country, I mean 3 in total. 1 from Portugal and 2 from Malta. I made a silent promise to go on holiday there one day. The following Monday, plain old Sophie Jenkins was back sitting with Kate in Miss Price's class, and it all seemed like a dream. Of course, I had to put up with some terrible ribbing about how I'd let the country down, but I tried not to let them bother me too much. By the time summer came, my 15 minutes of fame was all but forgotten. My mum had tried telephoning Tim Wainwright, but to no avail. According to Kate, who got the information from Ron, remember Ron with the bad teeth, who she was now dating, apparently I was no longer of interest to Bold Records. My career as a pop star was over almost as quickly as it had begun. After a discussion with Mum, I decided to leave school and start working at a local factory that made crisps. It wasn't the glamorous life that I had envisioned, but it was decent money, and the people I worked with were always up for a laugh. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye, and like a bolt out of the blue, my past as a primrose came flying back when Mum shouted up the stairs, "Sophie, get up! You've got a letter from the BBC." I stumbled downstairs, and sure enough, Mum handed me an envelope with BBC stamped on it. "What is it?" I asked. "Well, I don't know, do I? Why don't you open it and find out? Mum replied. Tearing it open, I read the neatly typed letter out loud. Dear Miss Shine, goodness, no one had called me that for over 2 years. We are about to start production on a new celebrity reality show and would be delighted if you would consider taking part. The show is called Highland Fling and is set in Scotland. The format is as follows. You'll be expected to live for a fortnight in small wooden huts with other celebrity contestants. You'll be expected to take part in various tasks for which you will receive small rewards, for example, chocolate or a warm shower. The public will vote each day for the celebrity they like the least to leave the show. The winner is the last celebrity remaining and will win the prize of a trophy in the form of a golden sporran and also their own chat show on the BBC. If you're interested, please contact us as soon as possible because the show starts filming in just 4 weeks' time. Yours sincerely, Head of Production, Highland Fling. Oh my God, Mum, I said, my voice trembling. What do you think? I think Sophie Shine is back in business, she laughed. Marathon of Memories. The residents of the old people's nursing home were gathered in the lounge, their attention captivated by the Paris Olympics on TV. Among them was Fred Tupper, a quiet, unassuming man who they were about to find out had an amazing secret. Fred sat in his favourite armchair, its upholstery worn from years of use, positioned perfectly in front of the large television screen. Today, the marathon was on, and despite recently celebrating his 87th birthday, Fred's eyes sparkled with the excitement of a youngster. He's starting too fast. He'll never keep up that pace. He'll have nothing left in his tank at the end, Fred mumbled to no one in particular. A young nurse, Mel, bustled about, handing out cups of tea and biscuits to the residents. Noticing Fred's intense focus, she paused and asked, "When did you become such an expert? The closest you'll ever get to the Olympics is watching them on the telly," she teased, the corner of her mouth curling up with amusement as she handed him a custard cream. Fred chuckled and finally turned towards her. "I know more than you think, young lady. I ran in the Rome Olympics before you were born, way back in 1960. Mel laughed, shaking her head. "Oh, come on, Fred. You can't expect me to believe that." Fred leaned back in his chair, a nostalgic smile playing on his lips. "Believe what you like, but it's the truth. I finished 4th in the marathon." He closed his eyes, and with everyone else in the room giving him their full attention, he said, "Let me tell you how it all happened." Growing up in the city of Sheffield, Fred had always loved running. He was just a boy who loved to feel the wind on his face and the ground beneath his feet. He ran everywhere, to school, to the market, through the fields. It was his escape from the tough life he'd been born into. By the time he was in his 20s, he was working as a machinist in a local factory. The job was hard with long hours and little pay, but it kept food on the table. His true passion, however, was running. Every morning before dawn, he'd slip on his worn-out pumps and hit the pavement, running miles before the factory opened. And every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he'd do it all over again. Money was tight, Mel. We didn't have fancy gyms or personal trainers. My gym was the streets and the hills. My coach was determination. Despite the odds, Fred's talent didn't go unnoticed. With the encouragement of his new wife, he started entering local races, and then regional ones. His victories piled up, each one a testament to his natural talent and drive. With each win, he seemed to get more and more attention from the press. First local newspapers, but occasionally he even got interviewed on the radio. One reporter asked, "What's next, Fred? A crack at the Olympics?" The Olympics? That was a dream far beyond his reach, or so he thought. One day, after a particularly grueling race, Fred was approached by a man in a sharp suit. He introduced himself as Mr. Edwards, a representative from the British Olympic Committee. He'd been following Fred's progress and was impressed. "You've got real talent, young man. Have you ever considered trying out for the Olympics?" he asked Fred, who was still trying to catch his breath after his latest win. Fred laughed, the idea seeming utterly ludicrous. "Me? The Olympics? I'm just a factory worker who likes to run." But Mr. Edwards was serious. He saw potential in Fred, raw and unrefined. With a little support and a lot of hard work, he believed Fred could make it to Rome, the home of the next Olympic Games. The next few months were a whirlwind. Fred's days started at the crack of dawn and ended long after the sun had gone down. He trained harder than ever, squeezing every ounce of energy from his body. The factory job fed his family, but running fed his soul. Mr. Edwards helped where he could, providing equipment and arranging for Fred to compete in qualifying races. "It wasn't easy, Mel. There were days when I thought I couldn't go on, when the aches and pains all seemed too much, but the dream of Rome kept me going." Against all odds, Fred qualified for the British Olympic team. He remembered the day he received the news, the letter arriving in a plain white envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it, scarcely daring to hope. But there it was in black and white. Fred Tupper was going to the Rome Olympics. A few months later, and he stepped out of the plane. Fred had never been outside of England, and now he was in Italy, representing his country. His eyes widened as he gaped at the marvellous city, its ancient beauty a stark contrast to the industrial grime of Sheffield. The Olympic village, where he was to stay, buzzed with energy and excitement, filled with athletes from all over the world, each with their own stories and dreams. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. I met so many incredible people. Athletes who, like me, had overcome their own struggles to be there. The opening ceremony was an amazing spectacle, with fireworks, music, and the parade of nations. Fred walked with his team, feeling an immense pride swell within him. This was it, the pinnacle of his athletic career. The day of the marathon dawned clear and bright. Fred lined up with the other runners, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. The race was grueling as the heat of the Roman sun beat down mercilessly. But Fred had trained for this, prepared himself for the pain and exhaustion. As the miles passed, he found his rhythm. The crowds along the route were a blur, their cheers a distant hum. All that mattered was the road ahead, each step bringing him closer to the finish line. He remembered the advice Mr. Edwards had given him. Pace yourself. Don't burn out too soon. The final stretch was the hardest. Fred's legs felt like lead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he could see the stadium ahead, the finish line just within reach. Summoning every last bit of strength, he pushed forward. I didn't win, but I gave it everything I had. When I crossed that finish line, I felt like I'd conquered the world, he said with a wry smile. Fred finished fourth, just shy of a medal. But to him, it was a victory. He'd made it to the Olympics, competed with the best in the world, and proved to himself that dreams were worth chasing. Mel listened, her curiosity giving way to skepticism. That's an incredible story, Fred, but no offence, it's a little hard to believe. Just then the TV screen flickered, showing a montage of past Olympic marathon finishers. Everyone's eyes widened as they saw the black and white footage of the 1960 Rome Marathon. And there he was, younger and leaner, but easily recognisable, crossing the finish line with sheer determination etched on his face. Mel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Fred, that's you!" He nodded at her with a huge grin spreading across his face. "I told you, didn't I?" The room buzzed with excitement as other residents and staff gathered around, watching the footage with newfound respect for Fred. They all looked at him, their eyes shining with admiration. Recovering from her shock, Mel said, "You're a legend, Fred, an absolute legend." He just chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "No, just a bloke who liked to run, love. Just a bloke who liked to run." As the TV coverage of the race continued, Fred found himself being asked for his thoughts and comments. His insights now met with awe rather than doubt. The young nurse who once teased him listened intently, hanging on his every word. And for Fred, it felt like he was crossing another finish line, one where his story was finally understood and celebrated. Just as the residents settled back into their seats, the TV announcer mentioned a special segment on past Olympic athletes who had missed out on medals by the slimmest of margins. The camera panned to an interview with a jovial Italian man, reminiscing about the 1960 marathon. And here we have the legendary Giuseppe Marino, who fondly remembers his fellow competitor from Great Britain, Fred Tupper. They say he was so close to the podium, it's still talked about today. The screen flashed a clip of young Fred and Giuseppe sharing a laugh after the race, both drenched in sweat but beaming with camaraderie. The nursing home erupted in cheers, and Mel couldn't help but laugh at the perfect timing. As the nursing home buzzed with excitement and admiration, Fred basked in the unexpected spotlight. For a brief moment, he was not just Fred from Sheffield, but Fred the Olympian. And in the nursing home lounge, with the Paris Olympics playing in the background, Fred realised that sometimes the greatest victories come not from medals, but from a lifetime of memories. One wish. Janet had always been a ditherer. She'd finished school, of course, with pretty decent grades, but then, well, everything sort of ground to a halt. While everyone around her seemed to have it all figured out, going to uni, getting jobs, buying their own homes, Janet just couldn't. Not for the lack of options, she had plenty of those. But the problem was, she was always in two minds about everything. She couldn't settle on what subject to study at university, so she put off applying. She couldn't decide what career to go for, so she didn't bother job hunting. Even her love life was blighted by her flip-flopping. It was as though every choice felt too monumental, too permanent, like it would lock her into some version of herself that she wasn't sure she wanted to be. She still lived at home with her mum, which wasn't as bad as people made it out to be. Her mum was pretty cool, really. But still, it wasn't exactly the life Janet had pictured for herself. Not at 24 years of age, anyway. Then, about a month ago, her granddad passed away. He was one of those old school explorers, or at least that's how Janet had always thought of him. He'd spent most of his adult life travelling to exotic places, countries across Asia mainly, and he'd collected all sorts of weird and wonderful things along the way. His attic was packed full of trinkets that were souvenirs from his travels. When he died, Janet's mum asked her to go over and help sort through it all. "Just separate things out," her mum had said one morning over breakfast. "Stuff to keep, stuff to sell, and stuff to chuck out. You'll know what to do when you see it." But of course, Janet didn't. She'd gone over to his house with every intention of getting cracking, but once she'd gotten up to her granddad's attic, she'd just stood there, surrounded by dusty boxes and old suitcases, completely overwhelmed. She picked up a few things, a wooden mask, some kind of brass figurine, but each time she was about to decide, she wavered. Keep it? Chuck it? Sell it? Who even knew what half this stuff was worth? It didn't help that the attic was stuffy and hot. So after about an hour, she'd given up and gone home. She told herself she'd go back the next day, except she didn't. Days turned into weeks, and she kept putting it off. Then, one Friday afternoon, when she'd run out of excuses and was feeling particularly guilty, she dragged herself back to the house, determined at least to make a dent in sifting through her granddad's stuff. As she was going through an old box, she found this dusty old lamp. Well, not exactly a lamp. It looked more like something you'd find in a junk shop, all tarnished and rusty. But something about it was oddly familiar, like something out of a movie or a pantomime she'd once seen. Smiling to herself, she muttered, "Why not?" and gave it a quick rub with her sleeve, just to see if it would polish up. Instantly, there was a puff of smoke, a bright flash, and then standing right in front of her was, well, a man. Sort of. Except he wasn't a man. He was wearing a turban and had this glowing, faintly transparent look about him, like he wasn't quite real. Right then, the figure said, clapping his hands together, "You've got one wish. Make it count." Janet blinked, convinced she was hallucinating. Maybe it was the heat, or the dust, or both. "One wish," she managed to stammer. "Just one." "Yes," the genie grinned. "I'm still in training, you see, so I'm only qualified to grant one wish at a time. You'd be surprised how much paperwork's involved." Janet stared at him. This was mad, completely, totally insane. She could wish for anything, anything at all. But as her mind raced with all the possibilities, that familiar feeling crept back in. She couldn't make her mind up. What should she wish for? Money? Love? Success? She couldn't decide. Of course she couldn't. "You've got all the time in the world," the genie said, though his tone suggested he hoped she'd hurry up a bit. "But I'd make it a good one if I were you." Janet thought about it, and thought some more. But no matter what ideas popped into her head, she couldn't settle on one. Typical, really. "No, take your time," the genie huffed, tapping his foot. "It's not like I've got anywhere else to be," he added sarcastically. Out of sheer frustration, she sighed and said, "I'm sorry. I wish I could just decide." The genie looked at her for a moment, a slight smile forming on his face. "Righto," the genie said, shrugging. "Your wish is my command." "No, no, I didn't mean that was my wish," Janet wailed. But it was too late. With a nod of his head, he vanished. Poof! Gone. Janet stood there for a few seconds, feeling like she'd wasted the one chance in her life to make everything perfect. What kind of wish was that? What a divvy. But then something strange happened. As she looked around the attic, she knew exactly what to do. The wooden mask? Keep. The brass figurine? Sell. The broken radio? Chuck it. It was like a switch had flipped in her brain. No more hesitation, no more second guessing, just clear, confident decisions. The next few days were a whirlwind. Janet found herself making choices left, right, and centre. She finally applied for a job she'd been eyeing up for months, and guess what? She got it. She even bumped into Tom, an old friend who'd always had a bit of a crush on her. And without hesitating, she asked him out, and within a week, they were inseparable. It was like her whole life had clicked into place, all because of that wish. The genie might have been a novice, but that one wish changed everything. Janet was no longer stuck. She was moving forward, fast. And for the first time in ages, she knew exactly where she was headed. Bruno's final jump. Jake never liked birthdays, especially the milestone ones. But turning 40, well, that was something he was really dreading. It wasn't just the number, though. It was the fuss, the birthday cards with bad jokes about grey hair and dodgy knees. He didn't feel 40, not really, but there was no denying middle age was looming fast. He'd managed to avoid mentioning it for the most part until Angela, his wife, had started dropping hints about what she'd bought him as a present. Apparently, she'd got him something special. "I just know you'll love it," she said, smiling in that way she did when she was pleased with herself. "It's not something you can hold, but it's an experience you'll never forget." Of course he tried to guess. Maybe she'd got him a day at a race car track. He could picture himself behind the wheel of some fast race car, roaring around a track like a professional driver, feeling a rush of excitement as he hurtled around bends at breakneck speeds. Now that would be a birthday present worth getting. But on the morning of his birthday, as he lay in bed reflecting on the horror of becoming 4 decades old, he realised his predictions were way off. Angela brought him a cup of tea and some toast, which was her attempt at breakfast in bed. She wasn't much of a cook, but he appreciated the effort. She then handed him a small envelope with a grin that gave him butterflies in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was excitement or nerves, but either way, he was eager to see what she'd planned. Opening the envelope, a brightly coloured voucher fell out. His eyes skimmed over the words, and for a moment his brain didn't quite process what he was seeing. A parachute jump? He looked at Angela, hoping this was some sort of prank. "You got me a parachute jump? Isn't it great?" she beamed. "I knew you'd never organise something like this on your own, and it's meant to be life-changing. You'll feel so alive." Jake forced a smile, his mind racing in 1,000 different directions. He had never in his life expressed any interest in parachuting. In fact, if truth be told, he wasn't even all that keen on flying. He only just managed to cope with their annual holiday flights to Spain, gripping the armrest during takeoff and praying he wouldn't embarrass himself by showing just how frightened he really was. Now he was expected to jump out of a plane voluntarily. The days ticked by far too quickly for Jake's liking, and before he knew it, the big day had arrived. He found himself in a section of the airport he'd never been to before, a cold, drafty hangar with the smell of jet fuel in the air. Jake could feel his stomach knotting tighter with every step. This was definitely not how he'd imagined spending his 40th birthday. As the instructor gave him a briefing, another man appeared beside him. Jake glanced over and was caught off guard by the presence of a guide dog sitting patiently next to an older man. It was a golden retriever, wearing one of those reflective jackets guide dogs usually have on. Jake smiled at the dog and then said to the man, "Hi," trying to mask his nerves. "Are you doing the jump too?" The man smiled. "Yes, I've been roped into it by my friends, though I'm raising money for a good cause." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. Here he was, quaking in his boots at the thought of hurling himself out of a plane, and this bloke, who was blind, was going to do it for charity. Ah, that's amazing. And the dog? Jake joked, nodding at the dog who was now wagging his tail. Oh, Bruno? Yes, he's jumping too. Jake blinked. Wait, what? The dog's going to jump? The man chuckled. Of course, he's my guide dog. Where I go, he goes. They've rigged up a special harness for him. So, will he have his own parachute? Jake asked, stunned by what he'd heard. The blind man seemed completely unflustered. No, he'll be attached to me by a long rope. Jake looked over in disbelief as the staff were busy attaching a rope between Bruno and the man's parachute harness. So many questions ran through his mind. Turning back to the blind man, Jake asked, So, how do you know when to pull the cord to open the parachute? The man didn't seem fazed in the slightest. Oh, Bruno has been trained and he's going to bark when it's time for me to open the parachute. Jake stared at him, trying to figure out if he was being serious. The way the man said it so matter-of-factly made it all the more bizarre. The idea of trusting a dog to know when to open the parachute was beyond belief. Training over, they left the hangar and walked out onto the runway, where they climbed into a small plane, and Jake's nerves kicked into high gear. The engine roared to life, and soon they were soaring upwards, the ground falling away beneath them. Jake could feel his hands shaking, his mind racing with doubts and fears. He glanced at the blind man, who seemed entirely relaxed, and then at Bruno, who appeared totally at ease as well. The instructor gave the final instructions, and before Jake could fully register what was happening, the door opened, and a rush of cold air hit him like a slap in the face. The blind man and Bruno were ready to go. The rope between them stretched taut. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as they all edged towards the door. And then, with a deep breath, they jumped. Jake first, followed swiftly by the blind man and his dog. Instantly, he felt the wind in his face and roaring in his ears. For the first few seconds, all he could think about was the sheer terror of falling. The ground was so far away, the feeling of weightlessness utterly overwhelming. Suddenly, Jake's parachute deployed with a jerk, and the panic he felt subsided ever so slightly. He was still plummeting towards the earth, but the sense of impending doom had lessened. He looked upwards towards the blind man, whose parachute had also opened smoothly. Below him, his guide dog, attached by a long rope, both of them floating down as if this was the most natural thing in the world. As they came in for a landing, with the ground rushing up fast, Jake shouted over to the man, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Do you need me to shout when we are about to land so that you can get yourself ready? The man grinned, and just before they touched down shouted back, No, it's fine. I'll know when we're about to land, because Bruno's rope will go slack. Buying friends. Barry was a lonely man, the kind of bloke who'd sit in a cafe with a cup of tea, watching the world go by, but never really feeling part of it. He wasn't one for small talk, and making friends seemed to be more trouble than it was worth. So after yet another solitary evening spent in front of the telly, he decided it was time to do something about it. He decided to buy a friend. The very next day, an overcast Tuesday afternoon, Barry wandered into the local pet shop. The place was small but warm, filled with the comforting smell of hay and the sounds of animals rustling in their cages. The assistant, a young woman with a friendly smile, looked up from behind the counter. Hi, she said. How can I help? Barry shuffled his feet, feeling a little embarrassed. I'm thinking about getting a pet, he began. Something to keep me company, you know? The assistant nodded. I see. Well, we've got all sorts. Fish are quite popular. Barry frowned. Fish? But they don't really do anything, do they? Just swim about. Not much of a companion. The assistant chuckled. True enough. Maybe not a fish then. How about a budgerigar? They're easy to look after, and the best part is they talk. Could be just what you're after. Barry's eyes lit up. A budgie that talks. That sounded perfect. He nodded eagerly. I'll take one. A short while later, Barry left the shop with a small cage in one hand and a cardboard box containing his new friend, a bright green budgie, in the other. He'd even come up with a name for his new feathered friend, Chatty. It was meant to be a bit of a joke, but deep down he hoped the name would turn out to be true. Back home, Barry set up the cage on a table by the window and carefully placed Chatty inside. There you go, mate, he said, peering into the cage. This is your new home. How about a nice chat? But Chatty wasn't having any of it. The bird just sat there on the floor of the cage, as silent as the grave. Barry waited, trying to coax a word or two out of him, but the budgie didn't make so much as a peep. After a few hours of this, Barry began to worry. Maybe Chatty was shy. Or perhaps he just needed a little time to settle in. The next day, though, things hadn't improved. Chatty still hadn't uttered a word. Barry, feeling a bit let down, made his way back to the pet shop. The assistant greeted him with a smile, but it quickly faded when she saw the expression on Barry's face. Something wrong? It's Chatty, my budgie, Barry said, a hint of frustration in his voice. He's not talking, not a word, just sits there quiet as a mouse. The assistant looked thoughtful. Maybe he needs a perch. Sometimes they like to sit up high so they can see what's going on. That might encourage him to talk. Barry nodded, thinking that made sense. He bought the perch, hurried home, and fixed it in the cage. There you go, Chatty, he said, almost pleading. Give it a try. But Chatty just ignored the perch, staying stubbornly on the cage floor, silent as ever. The following day, a disgruntled Barry was back in the pet shop. Still no joy? The assistant asked, her brow furrowing. Not a peep, Barry grumbled. She mused. Perhaps a small ladder would help. If he could climb up to the perch, it will give him some exercise and it might make him feel more comfortable. It sounded reasonable enough, so Barry bought the ladder, took it home and placed it in the cage. Come on, Chatty, he urged. Up you go. But Chatty wasn't interested. He didn't even glance at the ladder, let alone climb it. Barry sighed, feeling more frustrated than ever. The next morning he was back at the pet shop, his patience wearing thin. This time the assistant called over her manager, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp eye for detail. Maybe try a bell that he can ring with his beak, she suggested. Something to catch his interest. It might encourage him to start talking. Barry was willing to try anything by this point. So he bought a small bell and hung it in the cage. But yet again, Chatty wasn't impressed. The bell remained untouched, and the bird once more stayed silent. By Saturday, Barry was desperate. He trudged back to the shop feeling defeated. As he was explaining his troubles to the assistant, another customer overheard. Have you tried a mirror? She said. Budgies love looking at themselves. He might think it's another bird and start chatting away. The idea seemed a bit daft, but Barry was willing to give it a go. He bought the mirror and set it up in the cage, hoping against hope that this would finally do the trick. All right, Chatty, he said, this is it. Time to show me what you can do. I'm not asking for a full speech from Shakespeare. A simple hello will do. But the only sound in the house came from Barry regretting his decision to buy companionship. But the next morning, Barry woke up to a grim sight. Chatty was lying at the bottom of the cage, motionless. His little bird had passed away. With a heavy heart, Barry made his way back to the pet shop one last time. The assistant's face fell when she saw him, and he explained what happened. "Oh no," she said, her voice full of sympathy. "Did he at least speak?" Barry nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied. "Just before he died, he said one word." The assistant leaned in, curious. "What was it?" "Food," Barry said. For another great English lesson, click this link. I'll see you next time.